Welcome to the Contemplative Revolution. My name is Michael, and I'm the host of Personalist Manifestos. In this week's conversation, I talk to none other than Jon Coutts. If you don't know Jon Coutts, you're going to meet him in a moment. Jon reached out to me recently and said, "Hey, Michael, I just did this presentation on AI and theology. I wonder if you'd be interested in reading it." And I'm like, "Of course I'm interested in reading it. And you should come on the show and talk about it." So that's what we did. Jon has also written on Bart, Bonhoeffer, the church, film, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I think this is going to be a really good opportunity for you to get to know Jon, what he's about, and think about AI and technology as you listen in on our conversation. So with that, here's my conversation with Jon. So for people who don't know you, can you start as we always do on Personalist Manifestos? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Jon Coutts?
Sure. Yeah. Good to be here. I've been really enjoyed your conversations with people. Yeah, I tend to think like, who is John Coots? Only God and my friends know. But then my friends start telling me who I am. I'm like, no, you're totally wrong. So, still in process. But I'm a theologian. I care a lot about the church in Canada. I used to be a pastor in the Alliance denomination, which is what I've been brought up in and ordained in. Um, Married to Angie, coming up on 27 years here. We've got four sons. We're all over 16. Kind of the thing that we do together as a family is watch sports, especially soccer. So we're like Liverpool fans. We spent some time living in England, and so that runs deep. Canucks fan as well. Sports is a big part of my life. I'm also big into movies and music, and of course, theology is both my vocation and just something I can't get enough of. Just a way to think about the world. Did a PhD at University of Aberdeen, wearing the shirt today. I know you went there too.
Yeah, flying the
And
colors.
yeah, what else would I wear to talk to you? So yeah, that's a bit about me. Looking forward to having a chat about this stuff with you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. Yeah, we're both tortured Canucks fans. It's amazing how much that comes up when I talk to
Yeah,
people. Uh, and I gotta say, I come from an Arsenal family, so we can still be friends. The one thing I
it's
will
okay.
say is that the Liverpool FC like motto is my favorite. You'll never walk alone. It's
Yeah,
just a beautiful, beautiful, and the song. I mean,
it really
everybody's
is.
gotta admit that it's a beautiful thing. Okay, so how did you end up in theology before we talk about your various research interests? Because I do want to talk about that because you are kind of like me. It's like, okay, you do theology, but like what kinds of theology do you do? I'm like,
Yeah, and
there's
why?
nothing
Yeah,
I'm not interested in.
right.
But I'm always curious on people's like theology origin stories, like how they ended up where they are, because very few people start, their childhood thinking this is what I'm going to end up doing with my life.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in the church, you're always kind of doing theology, whether you're aware of it or not. But I know the question is like, why is a vocation? Or like, why did you end up doing it like as a vocation? And for me, that the probably the turning point is after I'd done my first stint as a pastor in Manitoba, and it was in the early 2000s. The church growth movement was kind of at its peak, although who knows whether. I mean, it still seems to be peaking. Um, and while I was pastoring, I just couldn't get away from this church growth movement's evaluation of what it meant to be a good pastor, and I hated myself. Like I just could not understand. Evaluating myself and our church against those standards just made me just deeply unhappy and deeply depressed. And it was then that like theological muscles started kicking in that I sort of picked up in college and be like, well, why are we evaluating church this way? And anyway, long story short, ended up leaving that pastorate and going to seminary, Briarcrest. And basically, the main thing my wife and I both were there a couple of years at seminary just to be like, okay, what is the church and why are we doing this? And it was in that time that I found a kind of a hunger for the classes and the learning and the books because now I had like skin in the game, so to speak. Like I understood what was at stake. And it was in that time that a number of profs and peers had a big influence on me, but probably most of all was David Gretzky, who's now the president of EFC in Canada. couple classes with him, and then having him supervise my master's thesis really made me realize that okay, this deep passion you have for like the church, kind of getting the gospel right, and then also understanding itself as church for the sake of the world. Not only is that a passion of yours, but I actually kind of felt like I was getting quote unquote good at it, or at least fired up about it. So it was then that he actually suggested I look into PhD studies, and that led me to Aberdeen and studying under John Webster, learning kind of Karl Barth school of theology. That when you do theology, it's for the church, and when you do it for the church, you're doing it for the world. So whatever sense you make of the gospel, particularly seeing the gospel as a gospel of reconciliation of all things, how does that affect the way churches understand themselves and operate, and then how does it affect our mission? Everything started to click into place for me. Not necessarily like everything started to make sense, but I just started to see like, oh, this is what I want to like give my life to. It's helping the church come to grips with this bigger sense of what we're on about. And after that, it's just a question of, do you get jobs teaching theology, or does it continue to be a hobby? And for me, I got to teach in England for a while, and then here in Calgary, and just have thoroughly loved being in the classroom, helping students discover, putting kind of problematizing pat answers and come to a deeper understanding of things. And then, of course, the writing and the engaging with colleagues in and out of the church. It's just been, it feels like I finally came home vocationally, at least, when I was able to do that. So that's a bit of that story for you.
Yeah. There's a lot that I can relate to there. I actually, part of my seminary experience was experiencing a similar discontent or questioning or maybe even angst about church growth or the mega church phenomenon. I think you're a bit older than I am, but
A little
I
bit,
sort
yeah.
of came of it age ministry wise in the early 2000s, and so I was in seminary at the time, and there was a certain model that shifted from like seeker sensitive, like Bill Hybels, Willow Creek, Rick Warren type ministries to more like the brash, sort of craft beer drinking,
Right.
crude joke telling, hyper masculine I watch MMA
Yeah.
brand of that. So it was kind of the next phase of it. And a lot of that stuff never really resonated with me because I think you and I are saying like, I want to go watch a Coen
Right.
Brothers movie and talk about the existential or nihilist philosophy, in this movie, right? And so it was just this phenomenon, but it attracted so many people, and there was this kind of boon of churches and people called to church plant to teach, preach, hour-long sermons and whatever. And there was that discontent that I felt, and a lot of questions that arose from it, which really became the source of uh, theological questions and research I'm still doing today. But that basic question of what is the church and why are we doing this? I think that is one of the questions of our time, especially coming out of all the political stuff, all the division and social sort of questions that we're dealing with, but also coming out of COVID as well, where
Mm-hmm.
um, going completely online was actually just the sort of logical end of what a lot of churches were doing. But this just took it to the nth degree and faster than anybody anticipated. And then the result of that is a lot of people like, actually, I don't really miss it. I'd rather sleep in or watch football or go on a hike. Or if I do attend church, I'm going to attend in my PJs in my living room because why not? Right. And so it's this like dematerialization of something that I'm sure you and I would both say there's the materiality of the church is important. It's not everything, but there's this enduring question of what is the church? What's it for? What we should be spending our time doing?
Mm-hmm.
And that leads into all sorts of questions, including the technology question that
Yeah.
we're going to talk about. But to situate a little bit more, talk about your other research interests. So you
Sure.
mentioned Bart. You also done a lot on Bonhoeffer. You bring the arts and
Mm-hmm.
into your work a lot too. So share a little bit about those pieces too, so people can understand a little bit about how you get some purchase on all these questions we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the arts thing is kind of where hobby meets vocation. I just really love films, like you've mentioned, and music, and sometimes I really find both in class and then in writing that sometimes I can explore the interface between a philosophy or a theological belief and the way it works out in real life by using like case studies that films present. And I feel like sometimes that works in classrooms. And so I've sort of over the years written a bit more on film and literature and theology just through the inertia of always finding sort of purchase on things like, I've got a thing in that's a thing on annihilation and arrival as like ways to explore eschatologies of body and time and stuff like that. So that's that's fun stuff. I wouldn't say I'm an expert film critic, but I get to roll with those people. But like you said, my main thing was Bart on forgiveness and reconciliation and how it impacts the way we look at church and mission. And when I kind of decided to move on from Bart and get even more into the ethics and ecclesiology stuff, for a while there was like Hauerwas and Wolf, but I really latched onto Bonhoeffer, partly through some influences at Aberdeen that you and I both know, Phil Ziegler, Brian Brock, others, some peers. And now that's just sort of my next project is I'm working on a book on Bonhoeffer and the mandates, as he called them, or kind of a reworking of Luther's estates. So that kind of gets me more into political theology, but kind of keeps me in the things I'm interested in. And not just that I'm interested in, but I think the church needs to think about its place in the world according to like understandings of like the political dimensions of the gospel, both internally. So that's the forgiveness and reconciliation stuff. What does it mean if you're in a community of Christ? What kind of politic goes along with saying that Jesus wants us to forgive one another? That was that piece. And then with Bonhoeffer, and if the church is supposed to be help the world become what God wants it to be, then what does it look like for the church to cooperate with other kind of social entities in this pursuit of a common good? And so that's sort of the Bonhoeffer piece. And along the way, of course, you end up having to think about current events, like um, lots of people focusing on ecology and climate care, and I'm interested in that too. But one of the things that's really grabbed me recently is technology, as it has you, but specifically this like seemingly brand new question of AI, and so that brought us to kind of like the bit that we're probably going to talk about most today.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I I remember you presenting actually as just you were sharing some material that you were working on for the mandates project.
You were
And
there, yeah, early
I was
days.
there. I was there. I can't even remember what year it was, but I do think that is a very timely question because we are in a moment where institutional trust is at an all-time low. So if we thought we couldn't get any more individualistic,
Yeah,
here we are. I
yeah.
don't know why I'm laughing. I think
What
it's
else are you gonna do? You're
laughter
gonna
out of
cry
fear.
on air?
Yeah,
You
probably. I'm gonna
could.
cry after this recording stops. No, but I this is one of the things that I really wrestle with is I understand why there is a severe distrust of institutions, and the alternative is equally, if not more scary. And so, how do we develop a critical and constructive account of the mandates, and how does that fit into not just our understanding of like ecclesial institutions, but social and political ones as
Yeah,
well?
yeah,
And I think getting into Bonhoeffer is a really generative move for sure. And I think this does actually fit into the technology question, and we'll probably get into it, but what do we have in the way of defense against principalities and powers that are out of control? Um,
yeah,
right? I mean, so
yeah,
what does it look like to develop a not just a critical account of exposing principalities and powers that have run amok, and technology is an amplification of those powers. But if it's just a bunch of individuals sort of doing what is perceived as best for them, what resources do we have to resist the growth and destruction of those powers? Not much.
yeah,
But then the
yeah,
question is like what account of the church do we develop, and what account of other social sort of institutions do we develop to actually, not make the problem worse, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, but like I think one of the fundamental things we have to realize is that so in the church circles that I run with, a lot of times when people talk about opposing forces that are up against God, they go to the realm of spiritual warfare, which is praying that people will be delivered from demons or demonic repression or whatever. And I don't want to discount that at all, but there's this whole other level in which the New Testament and theologians have kind of learned to talk about the demonic or the forces that are anti-God, and that is by noting the way that they get sort of woven into thought systems and structures and institutions, all of which I think we would say have been created good. I wouldn't say all of which. So not every institution is created good, but the ideas behind them, like that there be a government, that there be something like a working economy, that there be a thing resembling family. These are the things that Luther called estates and that Bonhoeffer called mandates. These are structures that just get woven into the way humans, right? We're political animals. We organize ourselves certain ways, and these can be good or bad. And when we talk about principalities and powers, we could use language of angels and demons, or we could use it like an adjective. When a structure is angelic, it is serving the goods of God in the world, or it is a testament to the good news of God. So a church institution could be angelic if it is serving the good news of and the good of Christ, but it could also be demonic if it has somehow become kind of perverted or even usurped from the lordship of Christ. And the church's role isn't necessarily to take over from any government that isn't doing it right, or to take over the economy, or even to replace the family or get absorbed into the family. Sticking with the sort of Bonhoeffer estates kind of language here, the church's role is to like preach the gospel into all those realms and to prepare people to be good disciples and good influences in those realms. And that, in part, sure, it does mean training people to stir in the spirits and pray against and do spiritual warfare of that kind, but also means being wise about the good in this world and the ways that we can help our society and our social institutions bend towards the good as we see it in Christ, or ways that we can resist them when they are bent against Christ. And that's what principalities and powers language helps us talk about. And that's really what brings me to my interest in technology. And I know for you too, probably like Jacques Ellul and others, they talk about technologies that they end up having a kind of life of their own. It's not just that I'm playing with a phone. I'm also contributing to like a whole like ecosystem that not only do I input to, but it also shapes me and it shapes our world. And a wise church will be one that's like, well, wait a minute, what is like not just a good individual use of these things, but what is our take
Yeah.
on the technological good or bad of the way that these things are shaping us, angelically or demonically or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And we'll get into this more at the end as we're both in ethics, right? So we'll work to develop a constructive ethic, as it
If we
were.
can, sure, okay.
Oh yeah, we will. We will.
We'll try it. All right.
I mean, I read your paper, your presentation. It helps get us there. But I
Great,
I
thanks.
would say, just in passing, and then you can sort of frame what you're doing in your thinking through technology and AI in particular. But it is interesting and a bit, I think, scary to note the politicization of spiritual
Mm-hmm.
warfare
Mm-hmm.
and even the hyper spiritualization of spiritual warfare. By that, I mean the way in which certain traditions, in their emphasis on spiritual warfare, have bound themselves to political movements that are quite brutal and volatile. And yet it's still this very spiritualized expression. So you literally have people praying next to people who are very, very violently taking over, right, political
Mm-hmm.
buildings. And this denial, uh, whether it's like sincere or cynical, that we're just here to pray. Like
Yeah.
our fight is not against flesh and blood, it's against
Mm-hmm.
principalities and powers. But it's like you were literally walking around the Capitol building the day before, like
Right.
people walked around the walls of Jericho before it was overtaken.
Yeah.
But this, like, the word wisdom, I think, is really key here of sometimes the way in which you resist is actually not this complicated like blueprint, but it's
Mm-hmm.
actually just hey, maybe you should love your enemy. Maybe our primary task is to be agents of reconciliation and not violence, right, in
Yeah,
this world. And how does that actually a very concrete and spiritual response to principalities and powers that are
yeah,
out of control
yeah.
and more effective ones at that?
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't mean to
Yeah.
make this about spiritual warfare, but I mean, the paper you're referring to, I framed my whole talk at our university about AI as deliver us from AI, use a deliver us language,
Mm,
partly to tease people, but also because I think my main beef with spiritual warfare, as it's commonly done, is it's just so one dimensional. People have this idea that I just got to pray against the demon, and it manifests in individual ways in individuals, and just we partly because of theological failing in the church, we don't really have vocabulary for assessing like the many dimensions in which things can go
hmm
anti-God.
hmm
So we'll like, to someone who thinks the solution to everything is to pray the demons away, well, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so I'll pray the demons out of someone, and then they'll be like, maybe I should also go see the doctor for whatever the thing is. And they'll be like, no, you don't need to do that. I took care of it. It's like, well, why not at both ends? Like, there's so many dimensions at which anti-God like forces are at work within our world that we just sell ourselves short when we just focus on kind of individual like spiritualized cures. And like what
hmm
I think what we're doing when we do ethics is a form of like spiritual warfare on like a social scale. We're trying to discern the times, discern the spirits, and you can't
Yeah.
do that once and for all for every other following generation. You have to do that in your time and place, like
Yeah.
even in regions and times. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so tell us about your latest foray into technology and AI. Like, when did you sort of have the seed planted for what you shared with me and what
Yeah.
I'll share with others and through the show notes?
Yeah.
When did you think, huh, this is something that I need to really do some serious thinking about?
Yeah, so obviously, like the AI boom has been coming for a little while, like the invention of big data, and even in sci-fi movies, there was this whole idea of starting to go, but it really was only like 2 years ago, right? That large language models and GPTs kind of got launched, and now they're like embedded in everything. And my first sort of like, whoa, what's going on kind of moment was we were at a university event, and somebody just put up of a fabricated AI video of Tom Wright, like welcoming us all to this event, NT Wright. And it took like half a second to realize it wasn't really him; it was an AI video. And I just found that so like intuitively disgusting that it led me to try to figure out, well, am I wrong to find that disgusting, or is it okay? And
Yeah.
someone around was saying, "Oh man, this AI thing is the devil." And I thought, yeah, it kind of does seem like it's the devil. So how is that? And so for a while, just joking about it. But then there came a point where we do these research conferences every year at my university, and we try to have someone give a plenary talk on whatever the topic is. And the topic was going to be technology because I kind of been half joking that AI is the devil. They thought to ask me to give me a paper on AI, and so I said yeah. And so when you do that, you got to give them an abstract. And I thought, well, here's how I think a theological argument against AI would go. So I gave that to them as the abstract. And then I had to do the honest work of trying to see if this argument holds up. Like you really have to be open to being wrong. And as I dug into it, I just realized, oh, the way that I frame this, like, even if I'm wrong, it at least helps me to articulate what I think is theologically abhorrent about AI. And I don't mean like AI generally. Now I'm getting very specific on large language models and GPTs. Like in the realm of knowledge and communication, they seem to actually work against the good of God for humanity in the world. And how can I sort of name what it is? So I tried to do that in the paper, and that's what you'll share with people in the show notes. I'm still looking to get it published somewhere,
Yeah.
but that's probably what we'll work through here a bit. I'd love to hear what you think about of various parts.
Sure. So I want to get, first of all, I want to get to your sort of in short form, your theological argument against AI. But before
Sure.
that, could you just lay out, just for people who may not be aware, like what a large language model is and what GPTs are? I think
Right.
most people are familiar, but just to be sure, in case anyone's listening, they're like, what the heck are Michael and
Yeah.
John talking about? That'd
Right.
be helpful.
Yeah, so the key, like a GPT or a large language model is a good word for it because it's pretty simple to understand. It's large because it's huge, right? There's this
Hmm
massive collection of data that has billions of what they call parameters or like tokens of data. That on one hand, the sort of initial use for big data was to help advertisers find us, right? And we agreed to let them have our data if we could just use like Twitter or Facebook, until those things themselves became bad. But like that was kind of the idea. But then from this big data, the next thing is the language, large language model. Well, the idea is how can we go from search engines, which like literally search the internet for the thing you're looking for, to predicting answers to questions. What do we mean by predicting? Well, producing a string of text that, because of all the data you can pull from, plausibly mimics like a meaningful answer or paragraph, or even now it's complex enough to do a whole essay in response to a prompt. And as this gets better and better and better, the large amount of data allows language outputs that more closely resemble plausible sentences. And where Chat GPT comes in is that Chat GPT's sort of genius is that it does so and it converts it to kind of like regular everyday talk, right? Chat. So it'll answer in a way that like feels like it's the way we talk. And so these are genius sort of devices, and the modeling part, large language model, is that it runs on uh, the systems they use have to sort of train the modeling, the algorithms, so to speak, that produce the text have to be trained on large amounts of data, and the way to do that is to create models that sort of mimic natural language, and that's a very like poor non-techie way of explaining it. But when we come down to large language model, it's not a search engine; it's plausible outputs of text based upon um, uh, kind of a network architecture that resembles the human brain. That's why they call it a neural network architecture. Layers and
Mm.
layers of modeling that try to produce a result. And this takes huge amounts of power.
Yeah.
That's why these massive, like hyperscale data centers are making the news, because they're using lots of energy and water from the regions. And there's a whole other level at which this is problematic there. But with all this power, they do something that search engines never did, which is they actually produce text. Now, a lot of the data they're using to do that is stolen, right? It's basically plagiarized. We don't necessarily have to get into that either. I avoided sort of both of those critiques in my own paper. My main concern was, okay, let's say it works well, and let's just ignore the stolen part for now and ignore the sort of ecological problems with these massive data centers for now. What about the thing itself? Let's say it like worked really well. Would it be good? Like, would it be
Mm.
good for humanity? What's lost? And as I looked into it more, I thought, there's a lot that's like really problematic here. Even if it's working well, the better it works, the worse it is in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for laying that out. I think it adds some really helpful just sort of coordinates for what we're talking about.
Sure.
I think one of the analogies that I like to use is kind of I don't know, I just have piece of this piece of rock. Actually, it's from the mountain that is supposed to be Mordor in Lord of the Rings. My friend went to New Zealand recently and got it for me.
Oh,
But looks like coal, right? So like your typical search engine goes and like finds coal for you, right? But then you have to refine it. But the types of technologies we're talking about is not only does it find all the bits of coal, but it actually does like the refining for you and then presents it to you.
mm-hmm,
And the question is like what you're bringing up here is like what are all the processes that need to be engaged in order to do that refining for me? Like there is an environmental cost to it, but
mm-hmm,
actually, do I trust that this end product is actually it's refined well?
mm-hmm,
That it actually burns cleanly and it's good for me and it's good for other people, right? Beyond a apparent immediate use of it. Um, I don't know. That may be
yeah,
helpful, maybe not.
no, it
But
does. Yeah, that's good.
right. But you're like, even if like the question you're asking is like, even if, okay, so the processes that it engages are above board. In this case, you're saying it's not, and you're right, it's just scraping the internet for everything free and anything that it can get its hands on to process, but also like even if it has a great final product and it's above board, would it be actually good for us? And that's the question you're asking. So how do you answer that, theologically speaking? Like what's the, because you are saying that I actually don't think so, but what's the theological account you developed to make that claim?
Yeah. So we've already sort of talked about the principalities and powers bit,
Yeah,
which is almost the where you go at the end. But the two pieces I think we have to get at are, well, this is the whatever LLMs and GPTs are doing, that form of AI, they're trying to mimic communication between humans, and also they're creating these shortcuts for better or for worse to sort of knowledge transfer and or even shortcuts around knowledge. So to think about what could be good or bad about that, we have to think about what it means to be human in terms of our knowledge and communication and cut beneath the layers of that. What is knowledge and communication about? It's about relationship. And then also we have to think about social entities or technologies and whether they're good or bad for us on a sort of like a massive sort of human social political construct. So to get at that, one thing you have to do is we'll ask, well, what is a human theologically, and then how are humans like supposed to um, interact in all our diversity? And for that, there's lots of ways you could go, but the way I went with my argument is that on the what is human question, we can go back to human creatureliness and their sort of development of Christian theology on the answer to the question what it is to be human. And on the sort of larger social communication question, I've just been thinking a lot about Babel or the Tower of Babel story and Pentecost, the way Willie Jennings and Gustavo Gutierrez do. So we can come back to that part in a little bit. I'll just try to overview my argument, and then you can pick out whatever you want or move us on. But
sure.
on the human creatureliness side, we understand that there's a lot of different ways of looking at what it means for the human to image God. Um, but we've discovered, especially into the 20th century, that there's some real big pitfalls about how we think about what it means to be human. If we think about humans in terms of like, well, our main thing is to be productive, like functional, like leaders of the universe, or at least of the earth, then we start to like evaluate all humans according to their productivity or their functionality. And no wonder capitalism and industry sort of get the Christian stamp of blessing because wow, we're just like so productive because of these machines and because of this economic system. Or you can have views of the human that are substantive. They isolate like an aspect of the human that separates us from the animals and makes us a closer reflection of God. And these are, sometimes we look at the intellect or the physical ability, or even the moral frameworks that we use. And this is fine and good, but it also can become problematic because we create hierarchies of human beings according to intellectual capacity or strength or whatever. And there's been sort of this renaissance. I wouldn't say they found something new, but in the 20th century, there was this need to reconsider colonialism and racism and the world wars, and all sorts of theologians are involved in this sort of reconceiving of the image of God, what it means to be human, and a lot of it kind of came together, kind of slowly on parallel tracks. It came together in our century. This realization, well, the image of God is defined by Christ. And how does Christ define the image of God? Well, Christ is the only human who is the image of God, like in himself. What does Christ do with that? He does not desire equality with God as something to be grasped, but shares it with others. And so, how do we take part in the image of God? We do not consider our interests above the interests of others, Philippians 2, but we image God by living in relationship. Now, of course, our substance, our intellect, our moral framework, our capacities and abilities, our functionality, our productivity, those all come to play in our relationship. But how do we relate in the image of God? Well, we consider others better ourselves, which this means like a leveling of hierarchies and a reorganizing of like human relationships. How does that cash out in terms of technology? Well, why are you making technology? To dominate the earth, to have power over other humans, to forward some sort of master plan for the human race, um, to accentuate our capacities so that we can do even more faster. Well, there might have been versions of humanity that theologians could have maybe seen some good in there, but if you think of our goodness as humans in terms of our relational interdependence, and you learn from like liberation theology and disability theology that to be human is to be a limited creature
Hmm.
who exists in interdependent relationship with others, where I don't, my goal is not to get rid of my limitations and to achieve autonomy, but is to learn to live in this sort of mutual sort of negotiation of our limits and benefits we can be to each other. That is like a totally different view of how humans can understand themselves and their own limits and their need for one another. Need for one another isn't a bad thing, it's a good thing. So technologies that come along and just try to sell us autonomy and no more limits and shortcuts to whatever our version of success is, they start to look really suspicious because like, well, wait a minute, that like seems nice. I'm glad I have like a device I can use to like Google map my way to whatever.
Hmm.
But like how much of this at what point has this become like a net bad for us because it's reducing our sort of human contact with one another, and apply that to LLMs and GPTs, and you're talking about the same way that in the 20th century people were like freaking out about airplanes and like the radio, how they were accelerating communication and transport. Well, GPTs just skip everything and take us to like immediate answers. They take away all human contact. They steal knowledge in order to get it into this data pool. And they give us like immediate answers that aren't even answers. They're just like gestures at something that seems plausible. At some point, that's like not just like problematic, but like anti-human because now to get answers, I don't need experts. I don't need to talk to other human beings. I don't need anyone. In fact, now I can exceed all my limits and do whatever I want. But the more dangerous form of that is that people with power, I'm talking about billions of dollars in political power, they can scrape up all the data and they can make us irrelevant too, the everyday people who, and so these powers, let's name names, the Elon Musks of the world, who are just, and the Googles and the Microsofts, who are making it, they seem to be doing good in making individuals have access to knowledge and communication, but they're taking the humanity out of it. And what are they doing? They're soaking up all the power for themselves as the sort of mediators of truth and knowledge. And with that, you lose the need for newspapers, journalists, universities, A&Ws where farmers go to talk in the morning. Like all the human communication, Canadians get that, right? You go to Tim Hortons and there's always the
Hmm.
especially a rural Tim Hortons. There's always just the farmers from the village are talking about the news of the day. You take all that away and you lose the humanity to knowledge and communication. And I think that's on the level of like what is good about humans. You've exceeded creaturely limitations in a way that actually becomes like anti-human on that
Yeah.
level. And then we could go to the sort of Babel Pentecost stuff if you want, but I don't know if any of that made sense.
Yeah, that did. Yeah, let's go there. I just wanted to make a couple comments and see what
Sure.
you make of them. I think your treatment and even your turn to the human is a really illuminating turn. It's one that I realized I needed to make when I was trying to even figure out how to write about technology. Like one of the challenges when I was, and Brian, my supervisor, will tell you this, is not just figuring out like what to write or what to write about, but how to write about technology because it's such a massive phenomenon. Do you talk about a particular technology? Do you talk about a
Right.
particular set of technologies? Or do you talk about it as this ongoing phenomenon that is always tied to human behavior and imagination and
Mm-hmm.
desires and values? And so I think the sooner that we can actually move our attention away from whatever seemingly new technology this is and turn our attention to the humans who are creating these technologies and using them and the stories that we're telling ourselves to justify the use of them, probably the better, right? So the way that we went from, okay, what's a GPT, what's a language learning model, uh, to what is a human, like those moves are actually quick, but they're connected. And it does say a lot that the people that are at the forefront of these technologies are talking about transcending what it is to be
hmm
human. So it also connects to the ideas of transhumanism, right?
hmm
Life extension,
hmm
anti-aging, colonizing new planets, all these sorts of
hmm
things. But at root, it if you're looking at it in the way that you are, it actually resurfaces enduring questions of, okay, I'm hearing all of these things about how convenient this can be, or how it's going to solve this problem, or it's going to capitalize on this opportunity, or it's going to save us here or save us there. Have we ever stopped to ask who we are and what we're doing here?
Right.
And so this turn to creatureliness in theology, this turn to relationality, this turn to dependence, uh, as much as that seems like an unlikely counterargument, I actually think it gives us a lot of resources to
hmm
resist where all of this is going. And what you said about locating the image of God in Christ and where that gets us, it makes me think of Vincent Lloyd's work. Have you read any of Vincent Lloyd before?
Yeah, but you'll have to remind me where you're going with that.
So he has a book called Black Natural Law,
Oh,
and
yeah.
in it he works through the he calls it the Black Natural Law tradition. So he looks at a number of figures who were, activists within the Black tradition, and one of the each chapter focuses on a different figure. So he looks at Martin Luther King, he looks at Fannie Lou Hamer, he looks at Frederick Douglass. But the one chapter that is relevant here is this chapter on Frederick Douglass, because he talks about Frederick Douglass's theology of the image of God, and I think it's really rooted in this Colossians, right? Christ is the perfect image of the invisible God. But if the image of God is a who, a person, and
hmm
the person, the archetypal person who is the Son of God, and we're derivatives of that image, the image of God is not a what. And what that does is actually open up so much territory for us to say, oh, it's all these sorts of things to
hmm
be human.
hmm
And so Frederick Douglass, he analyzes Douglass's speeches and writing when he often talks about the image of God, and it's anything from laughter to sorrow to righteous anger to even fighting. And of course, there's the famous account of Frederick Douglass fighting his slave master to get freedom,
hmm
and how, he narrates that as a profound and radical expression of what it means to be the image of God. But I think what you're basically the reason why I bring that up is it's just to say yes. And um, when we start turning to technologies to just not just perform tasks for us, but to reflect back to ourselves answers to any questions, as something as simple as help me find sources on this topic because I have an essay due in a week and I don't feel like doing research
Yeah.
to like what those things lead to, into deeper questions about who we are, what we should be doing with our time, like what matters and how that informs the other two. Like it just reduces everything to a shortcut answer when
hmm
the human reality is much more boring sometimes, but also much more complex and much more beautiful,
hmm
right? And so
hmm
when we allow the machine to retrieve answers for us, as compared to working that out in serious reading, serious, thinking, serious conversation, serious writing, such as the type that we're doing right here, what do we lose?
hmm
And so I think that a lot of this to me comes down to process. It's not
Yeah.
so much end product, but like the vital human
Right.
processes that make us who we are.
Yeah.
And I'm not, sort of advocating for like, in order to be human, you need to be able to do fill in the blank. But what I'm
Right.
just saying, like, even just being a human who needs other human beings initiates a process of relationship and dependency that not only benefits the person in need, but also benefits the other people who are attending to the person in need.
That's right.
And so when we're turning to shortcut solutions to anything, um, we lose that vital human relationship that if we don't have that, then it is a profoundly anti-human existence,
Hmm.
as you put it.
Hmm.
Um, but also you talk about there's the stories that are told, the rhetoric that is used, the benefits that are cited to getting on board with this as compared to being less skeptical as we are here, right? Like this, think of all the good we're going to do, right? We're going to
Right.
solve this problem of, think of all the jobs this will create, or think about all the bad jobs this will eliminate. Think about all the problems we can solve if we can just get quantum computing sorted out. We
Right.
can unlock the keys to the genetic code and,
Yeah.
cure all these diseases and stuff. And you're like, but meanwhile, a lot of the people who are at the forefront of this innovation and selling us all of those stories are accumulating power, accumulating wealth, and like all of those companies that you listed, like it, there's so much evidence of them getting into bed with the military.
Right.
Like I don't know if I've talked about it on this podcast before, but it just stunned me
Yeah.
when the Pentagon said, "Hey, we're wanting to update our servers,"
Yeah.
and they didn't even try and sort of clothe the project in appealing language. Like, yeah, we just need faster data processing so we can
Hmm.
be better at killing people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody was like Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle were all scrambling to get that contract. And everybody's like, who's going to win it? And they called it the
Hmm.
Star Wars contract to make,
Right.
increasing the speed of the most powerful military known to man,
Hmm.
increasing their ability to kill people faster and more
Hmm.
powerfully. They called it Star Wars, just to
Yeah.
make it fun. But yeah, Microsoft ended up getting it.
Yeah.
And like, how many people go to work and use the Microsoft Office suite,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
my brother just sent me a text. He's like, "Have you seen this?" And Facebook Meta just signed a deal with the army with these like crazy augmented VR reality helmets. So using their technologies again, probably for drone warfare, but also probably for people on the ground to make calculations that they couldn't otherwise calculate. But all of those calculations are based on data. How reliable? I don't know
Hmm.
how that data is being processed, whether you go here and shoot that person or go there and shoot that person. Like, do we really trust these technologies to make those decisions for us? Unfortunately, so many of the evidence that you can produce to help us answer that question is yeah, we are, and that should scare the beans out of us. Uh,
And I mean, do we trust them? It doesn't even matter if 99% of us don't trust them.
yeah,
If there's a 1% of the people that have the power to use big data to the ends that they see fit, they might
yeah,
even be well intentioned and on the right side of whatever war it is.
yeah,
Those are the people that are entrusting devices and let's face it, artificial intelligence to now, in the case of military actions, take actions that actually have no human trigger puller behind them. So no human is actually really responsible for what's happening. Then
yeah,
also it's like hard to know how to stop them, and we are just being forced to entrust so many, not only on the military level but day to day operations to what is essentially a very elaborate, complicated Ouija board,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like
That's the best way to put it.
at the level of like completing a paper, which is where as professors, where AI hits us most often. It's like, oh, someone used AI to do a paper. Well, on one level, it's usually a pretty end paper because it's just very predictable sentences and no creativity whatsoever. But let's say it was correct, so to speak. What did we lose? Well, we lost the student didn't learn much, if anything at all. And learning and means having to digest and mull over not just thoughts, but also get in touch with actual researchers
Hmm.
who have done that work first. And I know we never get in touch with them actually, but when you read a book or even crack a library catalog, you're getting in touch with hundreds and hundreds of individuals who have gone and done this work. That's like human interaction. that I know to like people in like, you know, 500 BC, our libraries and our catalogs and our search engines would have just seemed like off the charts crazy, like wild. But there's an acceleration to like the ability to get in touch with all different sorts of authors that the printing press and then the internet have enabled. But at the end of the day, it's still a human contact. A
Mm.
student has to learn from an author something, and then the learning comes when they have to try to explain it themselves. And sometimes we ding them. The difference between an A plus and a B is their language wasn't very good, but they're still in B range because they like articulated something. They had thoughts about thoughts that other humans had. But AI had just stolen all of that,
Yeah.
right? It has erased the authors and the researchers, and it has also erased the learning. And now it has also distanced the professor from the student they're trying to teach in relationship. And that's what we're doing every time we use ChatGPT. Like we're cutting off like complex infrastructures of like knowledge and communication and human resources in order just to get a quick answer. And lots of times maybe that's harmful. It's like, how do I make white sauce for my pasta? Well, never mind the fact that it could have just used the old school search engine to find a recipe. But even that seemingly harmless shortcut has also like just worked itself around the human work involved. Um, and I think the net effect, even though I'm not like judging individuals for any instance of GPT use, although students will get in trouble, um, it's not really the point. It's that the mass effect of this thing is a net bad for us. It undermines social infrastructures like journalism, expertise in medicine, university systems, on and on it goes. Mechanics, right? Um, and we don't need experts anymore. And that ends up meaning this sort of flattening of humanity. So you talk about the image of God being fulfilled in Christ. Well, how does the church model that? Well, it's through the sharing of charism, like spiritual
Mm.
gifts. Any one body of Christ on earth, a local church, is a group of people learning what gifts they have to share to the rest. And that means I don't do everything, and that's how a church is supposed to run. And so too, that's like a witness to society. If you suddenly get this machine that enables you to do everything and not need anybody, um, that's not good for society. That's not good for you, and that's not at all with the grain of God's purposes for not only human but humans' relationship to other creatures. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're both in teaching and it does happen, right? Like I have students all the time from undergrad all the way up to doctor of ministry who use ChatGPT and like technologies, and I just have the conversation and say, look, it's been flagged, I always have the you get one chance to fess up and you can resubmit.
Right. Yeah.
If you do it again, then we're gonna talk because character, plagiarism, and also the basic question of like, why are you here? If you're here
Mm-hmm.
just to get a job, like, why not use it? If you're here to learn and grow, which we're in humanities and theology, then there's no shortcutting the formative process of doing the work. And sometimes it's just because a lot of them work already in ministry or they're working jobs, they have families and they're stressed and they didn't ask for an extension. And they
Yeah.
just make a poor choice. And I say, if you
Sure.
need an extension, like I'll give it to you, because I'm like, I'm not on my computer at 11:59, p.m. just waiting to read your paper. Like
Yeah.
I got I got a few to read, so I'll just get to
Yeah.
yours later if you need it. But like having that very human conversation before I bring the hammer down. And then you have some
Yeah.
students who are English, as a learned language, and they'll say, like my writing isn't as good, and I was, using this to edit. I'm like, look, like what you said, I want to know your thoughts. I don't
Yeah.
want to know the thoughts of a machine polishing your writing. Like, if I know that English is a learned language for you, just write the best that you can in English because I can't read, say,
Mm-hmm.
Korean, right? Or some of the other, or Mandarin, some of the papers being written by students where their heart language is different. I'm like, I just want like it's for you to think out loud on the paper with me, and there's this gift giving exchange that happens when we do that. So if I know that this is a challenge for you, I'll just take that into account on market paper,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so how do we actually just have those basic human conversations
Hmm.
that lead to positive transformation, even in the event when it is used, and just re-clarifying like, hey, this is why we're doing it. It's for the
Yeah.
formational components. But
Yeah.
one thing that came up as I was reading your paper, I totally agree with you on a lot of these levels. Like we need reliable, informed sources. Uh, the deprofessionalization
Yeah.
of things like journalism or mechanics or any number of these things. And now it's kind of like I don't want
Yeah.
to say the deprofessionalization of relationship, but it's just like the de-relationizing of relationship.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I just saw a meme the other day where it's like millennials who are married now thinking about the dating scene. It's kind of like you caught the last chopper out of a war zone,
Yeah.
right? Like, but all these things, like I think there's something to be concerned about. And yet I also look at it from the other side of like, okay, libraries, um, the established academic institution, the professor, the subject matter expert, the professional journalist, so on and so on. On the one hand, I'm like, we need those folks, but also if we look at, say, the last, I don't know, like 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, you're like, did we also kind of dig our grave?
Mhm.
Because, the moment that we sort of get high on our own product or we become elitist or we become corrupt by the influence that we have, when we make it to these sorts of professional positions, right? Or like how libraries, when they're at their best, are places, with open doors and they're, places of knowledge and welcome and storytelling, all those sorts of things. And then also like, but librarians can also be really terrible gatekeepers, just as
Right.
professors can be really mean and elitist, just as
Yeah.
journalists can be like, you know, uh, selling their sort of spin to the highest bidder. Like, so on the one hand, I'm like, yes, we need all of those things. It's kind of like institutions. We need them. But also, I'm where we are now. I'm like, I also get why a lot of people are like, just burn it down.
Yeah.
I trust the tech person who's saying like we're giving the power back to the people. As
Yeah.
untrustworthy as I think that is, I also get the basic human impulse to want to see all of these things collapse because they haven't always put the common regular person in view when they're thinking about what is good,
Yeah.
right?
That's true. I mean, and I think a lot of times what we have done is dig our own grave when we've made these really important, I think, human like social good, like learning institutions and journalism. Just even stick with those two. You could even say medicine. I mean,
Yep. Yep.
access to doctors. We've dug our own graves by making them more and more inaccessible so that the people that are restricted access to these goods, we can't blame them for looking at other ways. These are, in fact, these are liberation, right? Um, Especially like in Canada, we don't have quite the same problem because we have, socialized medicine to some degree. But in America, of course, I would use WebMD, right? Like, of course, I would go online and try to like self medicate, like self diagnose, like
Yeah.
because the access to healthcare is not there. Like, it's a liberation to be given a tool. Um, Elitist universities that no one can afford to get into, or even when you can get in the door, they're so well, elitist is the word. The class structures are so heavy that anyone who like wears a t-shirt, when maybe this is in the old days, when you're supposed to look like a businessman, you're going to be so patronized and shoved in the corner that you can't access the very institution you got accepted into. So we have like dug our own grave by making these accessibility problems. But the problem is, these there can be forms of liberation that open those things back up again. But the shortcut ones that are run by billionaires are frauds. Let's face it, it's a fraudulent, it's a quick high. Oh, I can get information it would have taken me years and thousands of dollars to get access to before. Now I can have it in a millisecond. Well, that's nice for a little while, but years and now, we've lost and overall good. And if the billions and billions and billions of dollars that had spent on creating hyperscale data centers and forcing AI on everybody had been spent on scholarships and the sort of reform of our university structures and you know
Healthcare.
the healthcare, the legal battles that have to be fought in order uh, to make journalism good again, so to speak. To make real journalist entities free from sort of the capitalist infrastructure of clickbait. Like if that money had been spent on those things, then that would have been like a more truly and socially edifying good. Now I sound like I'm living in dream world though, because nobody's going to spend their billions on that because billionaires aren't good people. But like all that to say, like, well, they didn't become billionaires by being good people, right? But all that to say, like, the idea that these billionaire funded sort of shortcuts are liberative, it's only a short, it's only like a mirage of liberation, and it ends up not. Now, maybe it kickstarts something that makes us have to make learning more accessible, such as some of the ways that we're learning to make our classrooms available, at least hybrid. And then we have this whole question of, well, how do we retain the good of like in-person encounters that are such a key part of it? So we're still learning through some of that stuff. And so maybe some of this, like the invention of the internet and the big data stuff and AI is going to force us to do some of that slow liberative work. But let's do that is kind of what I'm arguing, because that's the true liberation, rather than this sort of shortcut mechanism that big tech wants to give us, which really it just digs the grave even deeper and replaces the old powers, the stodgy university professor who's difficult to get in touch with, the elitist journalist who's too big for his ego, and um, but it replaces with that with some other power that's more insidious and now invisible to us. So that would be kind of my argument there. I mean, it's right to want liberation, but liberation is hard infrastructural work.
Yeah.
And so we need to not get distracted by shiny lights, and machines.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. One of the key themes in Elul's work is freedom, which comes from hope, right? Freedom,
Jacques
freedom
Ellul's
thrive.
work. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And he talks about freedom, in our so-called liberal, progressive, democratic society. Everybody talks about freedom like it's just this inherent thing that we have when we're born into this world, but actually it takes work. It takes investment, and to know where your sense of freedom comes, just think about what you hope in when everything goes to pot,
Right.
right? And do you have a hope beyond the hopes of this or that sort of worldly thing that promises you liberation, but in the end it actually enslaves you?
Mm-hmm.
I do want to turn to your comparison of Babel and Pentecost, because I think
Sure.
you're doing really interesting work there, and you bring that into this conversation. And I think we've spent a bit of time in sort of the sociology informed by theology here, but how do Babel and Pentecost add another layer or frame for what it is that we're talking about?
Right. So, I mean, I should say for those that kind of aren't well read in this stuff, I'm totally appropriating other people's works. So, Gustavo Gutierrez, Willie Jennings, these are two theologians on Babel and Pentecost that I'm just basically riffing off of here. But the it builds on the point about creaturely limitation and human interdependence. The Babel story is a story of technology, right? They learned to make better bricks and build a tower. But also, if you read the whole of its context, it's a story of people resisting the command of God, which had been to scatter across the earth, right? And that's the main problem for God, is that these people aren't scattering anymore. And then there's also preachers will always point out the pride problem. They want to make a tower to the heavens to make a name for themselves. So they're defying God on a number of levels. But technology is right in there, right? Because technology is the tool they can use to defy God's scattering command and also to even play God or act as God, make a name for themselves. And at Babel, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but at root, it's like it's using a technology in a way that is anti-God. Now, is are bricks bad? Well, no, that technology of forming bricks is arguably not bad. I don't know what you would say Elul would say about this, but technology itself, the ability to make things to do things, isn't necessarily bad, but it was put to anti-God purposes. Now, eventually we make towers, and I think we would agree that not all towers are bad, but in that case, it was a defying of something that God had said to do. And the scattering thing is really important when we come to Pentecost, because Gutierrez and Jennings point this out, that God wanted people to scatter and then punish them when they didn't. And the form of that punishment was to diversify their languages. Then what we get a sense of by the end of Genesis 1 to 11, before Abraham gets called to be sort of the covenant people for God to rescue the world from this problem, by the end of Genesis 1 to 11, we see God wanted a diverse human race. Humans tried to soak up power and autonomy and like control for themselves, and God put problems in their way to make that harder and harder, right? And the diversity of language is therefore not a bad thing. Just because it was a punishment doesn't make it bad. It was God's original good. So fast forward to Pentecost with the birth of the church and its mission for Christ. Talk about Christ being the fulfillment of the image of God. What does the Holy Spirit do? There's this initial sign, besides the flames and the winds, there's this sign of tongues, right? Which in this case isn't ecstatic speech, it's actual people who 1 minute ago were like Galileans on the streets of Jerusalem, and the next minute ago they were speaking the languages they'd never learned or heard before. And this is, as Jennings puts it, this is a one-time miracle that the church is going to follow up with like they're going to follow the sign of Pentecost by giving themselves to the task that it presents. And that task is not to sit here and pray for the miracle that I'll magically be able to speak German so I can complete my research, but the task is I got to learn German from actual German people,
Mhm.
right? And I don't actually know German until I know German people and the culture. Like you can't just like Google Translate your way and fake your way through Pentecost. Like you actually have to, the sign of Pentecost, diverse people unified in Christ, not by the erasure of their differences, but by the appreciation of them. That ties in right in with our view of humanity. So then if you have technologies that are giving you shortcuts to Pentecost, like shortcuts to human unity, the question you got to ask is, well, what happened to the human element of that? But then also what power now is mediating or translating or communicating for us? And it's not irrelevant who the mediators are. Is it Microsoft? Is it our megachurch super pastor missionary? Is it this, that, or the other thing, some economic power? And if it's not mediated by Christ, then it's going to tend towards the soaking up of power, right? And the mediating of all human speech. And it becomes this sort of like anti-Pentecost, right? And I mean, not to be melodramatic, but if GPT is selling itself as something, it is that,
Mhm.
right? And that just seems to be like a total shortcut on the mission of God that's presented to us in like a robust view of the church that is animated by the Spirit. So that like I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago for research. That's why I mentioned that. Yeah, I had to lean on some translation devices to try to communicate with like librarians and people that I wanted to order bratwurst from. But because my German is just so badly spoken, but I resisted the urge to just let AI like
Mm.
communicate for me with my device because I just
Mhm.
would feel gross about that because I haven't earned the right
Yeah.
to talk to real Germans. Like I would have to embed myself for a while. Now, because I'm speak English, I speak the power language of the world, and most people could talk back to me in the language they understood. I know, but even that tells you something.
Yeah.
It's the economic powers of colonialism and America that have given me the privilege to travel the world because everyone knows English. But that doesn't mean I should just use that privilege, like to exploit people groups and just like have a shortcut over like human communication. And this is Willie Jennings' whole critique of missions that got soaked up into colonialism, right? And so now we have the device in our pockets that is just offering us like easy easy access to a thing that actually is supposed to be hard, right? It's supposed to involve like human, maybe even frustratingly slow human communication. And I just think if we're going to embrace AI or LLMs, we have to do a lot more thinking, at least as a church, before we say, okay, that's okay.
Mm.
And the speed at which we're just embracing it and saying it's inevitable just seems to me so like, whoa, whoa, whoa! Like the burden of proof should be on the machine
Yeah.
that's offering this to us. Did that get
Yeah.
at what you wanted to get at, or do you want to build on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. And the burden on the proof of the people who are advocating the use of the machine or developing it and selling it, whether like literally or metaphorically.
Right.
As you talk about Babel versus Pentecost or Babel, depending on how you want to say
Yeah.
it, it seems to me the key distinction, and I think you helped me get here, is the story of the Tower of Babel is one of centralization of power through technology and one language,
Hmm.
whereas Pentecost is about a common language in view of this broader work that God is doing to unify people without bypassing their
Hmm.
particularity
Hmm.
or abolishing their particularity.
Right.
And the fact that think about it, Pentecost is about as like the dropping of the tongues of fire, like the spirit. I mean, like that's as unmediated as you get,
Right.
right? I know I'm with Bonhoeffer, in the sense is like immediacy is an imposture, or like it's
Hmm.
dangerous to think that we never can get out of, or sorry, that it's dangerous to think that we can have an immediate apprehension of anything,
Hmm.
especially God, because we're getting into the territory of idolatry.
Yeah.
But in the Babel story, it's let's innovate, make these bricks so that we can build a tower that reaches the heavens with a view to making a name for ourselves and basically accumulating power. And in that sense, it's actually like very authoritarian and fascistic, because
Yeah.
the whole idea of fascism is to like draw people in and bind them together, but there's like a centralized
Hmm.
authority to all of that. And of course, you don't get any of that without the aid of technology and a common language,
Yeah.
right? And the elimination of other languages and cultures.
Right.
But God is in Pentecost and so many other places is going in the exact opposite direction. I mean, you talked about Philippians too, right?
Hmm.
Like Christ was equal with God, and yet he didn't count that as something to be grasped, but emptied himself of it. And if you call yourself a Christian, you better be willing to do that as well.
Right.
And yes, there's a common language, like have the same mind among you, right? Speak in these ways, like think meaningfully about what these words mean when we speak them and how that informs how we live. But you don't leave behind who God made you to be,
Hmm.
right? You're all one in Christ, not one in a nation or a nation and its technologies that sort of bind it together and give it power.
Right.
And so I think if we relate this to principalities and powers, like Elul isn't against technology altogether, and he can come across like that and others like him. Um,
Okay.
but I think it really comes down to like we can't foresee, he says, all of the outcomes, right?
Right.
We can spend so much time thinking about the causality, the cause and effect of what we invent, and that's good, and we should do that. Virgilio says that as well, right? He has the famous line, "The invention of the ship is the invention of the shipwreck," and
Hmm.
we should think as much about the shipwreck as the ship when we're inventing it, so that we can prevent shipwrecks. And if we don't, we're not actually being responsible, and then therefore there's a certain degree of guilt for the shipwreck because it's like
Right.
we couldn't have seen this coming. You're like, maybe we should have.
Hmm.
But there's also unforeseen consequences, and you have to just acknowledge that. But I think this is where it gets into to not as what is internal to us, like, oh well, just will it to turn out right, or just listen to your conscience and do as well. But like, what is external to you that is informing you, motivating you, and propelling you when you do this, right? And if you compare like the motivating factor for Babel, it's classic old power, right?
Hmm.
That it's just desire for power. Whereas Pentecost, it is a movement of the Spirit of God. And Israel is told, don't make images of like graven images, right? But there is a moment where God says, okay, it's time to build a temple. And I'm going
Yeah.
to tell you everything to do.
Yep.
How measurements and materials and what type of figures and where they go and all that sort of stuff. But there is a patience and a waiting for that inspiration as compared to a self generated will to build something that we think is going to glorify God, but subtext it
Hmm.
actually might just glorify us, right? So,
Hmm.
so what is that? This is getting into the principalities and powers conversation now. Is like, what powers drive you? And Elul has names for those, and I didn't want to talk about it, but I'll just throw that back to you first before I get into that. Is what do you make about it? Is locating not so much like within the self, the individual self, and like willing ourselves to do this right, but actually how do we, if we call ourselves like Christians, disciples of Christ, like the it's something external to us or someone external to us or someone's external to us that help us and it's not something that we just need to like
Yeah.
try harder.
I mean, sometimes we can figure out the right thing to do by examining our motives, but the problem is when we live in a world where like systems and infrastructures and technology have been built up so that none of us are even starting from like a morally neutral ground. So like
Right.
I can will and have good motives, but I'm still operating within a system that is fundamentally like geared towards something bad, right? So I'm always participating, even with the good intentions.
Yeah.
It's something that could be like destructive. Maybe not just because of what I did, but I'm participating in it. So motives are one thing. We also have to ask what are the systems that I'm participating in, and that's where you get into principality and powers. Like, is this angelic or demonic? Does this serve the will of God or not? And that's where you have to evaluate. Well, does this system I'm using, am I participating in a thing that um, feeds empire and totalitarian sort of power, either through economic or government structures? Or am I participating in a system or a technology that enables me to have human contact and to be a liberative presence? And potentially, there's never anything that's all one thing and none of the other. Like, we're always, as Bonhoeffer said, every time I act responsibly, I am guilty. Like, we're always acting in a realm in which we're participating in something that isn't. I mean, every time I drive my car, I'm participating in ecological destruction. I still have to drive my car. And I'm asking, well, maybe I don't have to. People maybe can shout at me for that because I've given up. But like, there's a point at which we have to say, but what are the good uses for this?
Hmm.
And how can I, not just by cleaning up my motives, but also how can I seek a good use? And then there's points at which we have to say, I need to resist this as much as possible, like just not participate in it. And
Yeah.
then there are also things where not only do I not participate in it, I actually have to try to stop it. This is protest, it's civil resistance. And I don't know that any of us can make those judgments on our own. The little things we do, like recycling and taking transit a little bit more, those are individual things. But on a larger scale, sort of principalities and powers level, evaluations of technology and government, economic systems, and so on, the church needs to be mobilized. And this is where theologians and ethicists need to get kind of back in the game. I think it's our fault necessarily, but we've been sort of shut out of church um, discernment processes uh, for discerning the good
Yeah.
and then educating the people. Here's what we're trying to participate in as a church, so that we can have a net good for what God thinks is good, and that's there's just no shortcut around that. And uh, but what we do need to do is get our kind of get reinvigorated as a church for recognizing that is part of our task.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say the theologian is the center of the church again, but like we've sort of left a little bit of our moral discernment at the door, or left it up to like individual intuition and like motive adjustment, and sort of sold some of the soul of the church. And so in the contribution of many vocations to the church, we need to revive the vocation of theologian and ethicist, not because now they're the king of the castle, but because that's kind of a muscle that we haven't been operating as
Yeah.
a church, at least as an integrated way as we can. And so the burden also lies on like universities and seminaries and professors to not do their work in an ivory tower like it used to be in the old days, but to do their work in a way that is accessible and interconnected. And I don't know. I think that's a way forward if we have any hope of making these sort of judgment calls in our time. We've
Yeah.
got to reactivate that process.
Yeah. I remember I was meeting with a group of scholars who research in this and then people who work in the tech world. And there was one conversation that we had that was really fascinating where we actually talked about where where do we actually develop like our ethics of things we shouldn't make or unmake? Like we're
Mhm.
always talking about what we should do and shouldn't do, what we should make and shouldn't make. What are things that we made that we should just shut down?
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, that was really, really helpful. And so I coming out of that, I thought, oh man, um, maybe when we think about design, we should think about like designing tech, like we should design tech that actually forms us to need it less, right? So that the more you use it, the more you actually become more independent of it. But I also thought about this, I think about this a lot in terms of what you're saying, like in terms of challenges for those of us who work in the academy and work in theology in hopefully in service of the church is this actually of a not even common language, but like common understanding of like people like you and I are like, hey, we're here to help. And they're like, I'm not sure I want your help,
Yeah, right. You guys just make
right?
things
Because
more complicated.
we're just gonna make it more complicated, more uncomfortable, whatever, whatever. And in a certain sense, I'm like, you could use a little bit of that. Like if you're like, I'm
Right.
totally fine, I'm totally comfortable, I think we're doing well. I'm like, that's scary to me. But I've been on this journey of realizing that even doing this podcast and having people engage with it, but even with people who like bought into this sort of thing talking to me about like, Michael, those clips you post are super long and they're always serious. Like, why are you always serious? Like, is there more? The subtext there is like, are you ever not serious talking like, in 3 minute sound bites of this or that thing that Bart Bonhoeffer or whoever said? I was like, yeah, all the time. Like I don't do this all the time. And so it just kind of challenged me to share in the public sphere like the part of myself that has really ridiculous and very basic human thoughts about things that just don't make sense to me or things that I find entertaining or things that I find tasty or things that I think are dumb and we should stop doing them. Not like big political commentary, but like very, very basic things. And how that has generated so much more engagement and warmth than any of the super serious
Sure.
theological stuff that I do. And part of me laments that because I'm like, nobody cares about the serious stuff. But then I'm also like, no, these things relate because as they start to see that people like John and Michael are humans and we also laugh and get frustrated by the things that everybody else gets frustrated by, um, then this thing that seems very foreign and uncomfortable and weird and complicated becomes a little bit more approachable. And as we become more approachable, then we might actually have that awkward conversation about, hey, you should really think about this, or maybe you should read this book, or maybe you should stop listening to that podcast because it's poisoning you, or whatever. But
Right.
but I'm in this new phase of like my approach to technology up until this point has been so critical and I think I'll never not do that and I'll never not be iconoclastic, right? But there's a side of me that also is exploring what you're saying is like, yes, and what does it mean to live well and faithfully and joyfully, despite the fact that we are so enmeshed in these powers and like, yes, there are concrete things that we can do to make change. And yet, if you actually look at who the people of God are called to be, when has it not been trying to be faithful and joyful in the midst of a very brutal sort of world scene? And I mean,
Mhm.
where we're at now is a unique instance of it for sure. But if you really just sort of look at the broader picture, it's like, oh yeah, this isn't actually outside the norm. Maybe it's new clothing, new technological clothing, but we're still just trying to be faithful pilgrims on this world, um, and hope beyond hope that it is possible to create change, even though principalities make it seem like it's impossible. And how do we uh move beyond just critique to a constructive account of what that looks like?
Yeah,
So
I mean, you have to be an irenic kind of participant in the things of this world. I mean, like, some people are called to be Luddites and to be fully resistant to.
Hmm.
I'm a bit of an early adopter, but I think we also have to be um, careful and willing to reevaluate. So, like, one good example is, Twitter or Facebook. I'm so tired of people saying, "Oh, kids today need to learn to get off social media." Well, the problem is the social media is being run by bad people who have used the algorithms to do bad things to us. So once you become aware of that, you can actually adjust not only your usage, you can look for, and it's not everybody's job to do this, but those of us who are
Hmm.
called to like ethical or careful deliberation on behalf of the church, we can research like, are there better ways to do this?
Hmm.
Or maybe I could just become a Luddite that is like just totally against all of it. But there are better ways. Like there are message systems that are about human contact. And those are probably the best thing about the internet is that we have group chats.
Yeah.
Like, tell me something wrong with group chats. Like, group chats seem like a human good, other than like some of the things that go on there might not be good, but like emojis are even like a human good. Like when we're connecting across distance, but also like people are jumping over to Blue Sky, not just because it's the new shiny thing, but because there's been enough people realize the way these social media sites have been run have been toxic and built for toxicity. And there's a group of people, credit to them, they're trying to build a social media website that actually runs against the grain of some of the toxic impulse.
Yeah.
Good for them. How long it lasts and whether it works, who knows? But a year ago, when enough of a critical mass moved over there, we actually have a thing that's usable now for the thing that can be a
Yeah.
decent version of good social media. So, like, I think people need to be in tune with one another and even use these devices against their worst impulses. So I'm using the internet to become a better user of the internet. You're using podcasts to help us have conversational modes of theology. I really enjoy
Hmm.
podcasts for that. So,
Hmm.
and we laugh in your podcast and show that we're not like eggheads and ivory towers who are just looking down on everything, even though, there's a critical element to being an ethicist or a theologian. Like,
Oh yeah.
and so these are ways of like utilizing the things that have been invented to work against the sort of godless or lordless sort of strains of those powers. And in as much as we can get empowered and empower our neighbors and friends to adjust on the fly, we can be a force for good and potentially have networks of relationality where when it's time to actually resist, we're able to use those very mechanisms like chat, um, group chats to resist. Meet me at the corner. We're going to stop people from doing a bad thing. Like, you know,
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah. I mean, again, we're back to the question of the human, right? What type of
right,
person are you becoming when
right.
I mean, I'm not a virtue ethicist, like full
Sure.
stop, but I think this is
Neither am
what
I.
the virtue ethics have to teach us is what type of person are you becoming when that question or that problem arises that you couldn't foresee. How do you act,
Yeah.
and who do you act with? And I think you're right too. Like it, a lot of times it's looking at the younger generations and blaming them, kids these days. But I'm like,
Right.
last
Right.
time I checked, I've said this before, and I'll say this again. Actually, I feel it's like the boomers who are the real problem on social media,
Well, now it's
right?
Gen
Like,
X. It's my group
yeah,
now that everybody is
yeah,
probably rightly
it's.
blaming. Yeah.
But Alul talks about he develops an ethic of non-power his sort of middle to late sort
Mm,
of career, and he basically says that for though it's not saying that those who don't have power to begin with should just be happy with their place and not
right. Yeah.
ask for more. It is actually a call to those who have power of any kind and to ask the question, am I willing to let go of it so that others can receive um, the benefits that come with the power that I've
Right.
received? And if you're not willing to do that, then you have a serious problem, right?
Yeah.
You're probably in bed with principalities and powers, and you're not willing to get out, right? And so he names the power that propels technology, the sort of lordless power, as you put it. I'll put that in the show notes. People can read that because it's a great essay
Mhm.
by Bart.
Yeah.
but he says it's the spirit of power that sort of drives the engine of modern technology. So it's kind of related to Nietzsche's will to power, but
Right.
it's he's not altogether against Nietzsche's will to power. He actually says it's probably been misinterpreted. Like the basic human, Bonhoeffer talks is like the drive towards life, the drive to transcend your circumstances so that you can just like live and survive and thrive, right? But in our age, that drive to life or will to power becomes just totally unhinged and out of control. And it's precisely that spirit that is like driving the building of these massive technologies and empires and motivating people who want to, colonize Mars instead of just figure out how to take this care of this planet, as compared to leaving it so we can ruin another planet. But he says the other side of that dialectic is the spirit of lies. So that the stories that we tell to justify the growing power of that
Hmm.
spirit of power. And so his
Hmm.
response to it very practically is, uh, don't get into the power game because it does not end well. So
Right.
if you have
Right.
power, give it away to those who don't have it and
Yeah.
see what happens.
Yeah.
Um, I'm pretty sure that's what the kingdom of God looks like.
Mm.
And if we're not willing to do that, then we have to ask ourselves, are we really truly who we say we are, Christian? Um, and we have to watch out for the danger that comes when we want to accumulate and cling to power as compared to give it away.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you make of that for a constructive ethic?
I agree, and it just makes me think of. I know you probably need to bring this to a close soon, but I was just thinking, like, watch this space for what Pope Leo does. Like,
Hmm.
it's interesting to look into. Like, the Roman Catholics have now got this new Pope, and he chose his name Leo.
Hmm.
Turns out because of some of the Catholic encyclicals or circular letters that had been written by Leo, Pope Leo, in the late 1800s. Um, And what was the problem at the time, that Leo was confronting? On one hand, it was communism, which was seen as this sort of accumulation of totalitarian power in a governmental form, but it could also happen in economic forms. And then the other villain to be avoided was this rampant hyper individualism that capitalist Western nations were trying to sell.
Yep.
Individualist seizing of the will to power for the individual and autonomy versus communism, which is a form of totalitarian. And what did that Pope Leo do? He said the Catholic Church needs to be about helping the world to build social structures that work towards what he called subsidiarity. And subsidiarity is like this principle that the smaller the group, the better,
Hmm.
right? So if you're a big entity, a government or an economy, you need to empower smaller groups,
Hmm.
right? With whatever technologies or infrastructure you build, it needs to empower localities. But also, if you're an individual, that's not an end in itself. You need to find out how to use your vocations and skills and abilities and just your person to invest in local groups. So subsidiarity takes you out of the individual into the local. It also takes you out of the totalitarian or sort of like amassing of power into empowering localities. And that's a good way to think of technology too. Autonomy and totalitarianism are to be avoided, and the way we use our tools and structure our societies and even our churches can build into human contact at a group sort of social level. And apparently this new Pope Leo is like part of his sort of reason he was chosen is because of the message to the world at this time and place about kind of reviving that principle. And I think that's really exciting and good and is at the core of something good about the gospel, right?
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I think that's a wonderful place to end. That's a
Yeah.
compelling vision. And I could go on about how that connects to some of the core elements of the personalist vision, but it is
Oh,
very much that. It's not total anarchy, but
right.
it's a very grassroots type of socialism, that would distribute power among communities that would then connect every once in a while and discern together what is in the interest of all of those communities. And if you have money, you should fund groups like that to be able to do that. You
I
know?
don't, but I agree.
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
like,
I know that you and I don't. I'm just putting it out there to anybody listening or watching who
yeah.
might.
Well, I'd love to see I love what you're working on. I'm really curious to see how you unpack that manifesto because it seems good, man.
Yeah, well, we're unpacking it in real time with
Yeah,
conversations like these. So thank you for your
good.
time, John, and all the
Thank you.
best.
Yeah, thanks a lot.